So at this point, you're probably asking, well, how do I get custom animation for this platform and this platform and this platform? And the answer would be, well, the same way that we get customization for everything else. We need to figure out what piece of data we can pull into a variable that we can slot in for our custom animation. And if I look around, I may notice something like Animator. I click on here, it's like, okay, well, what is this line? And originally we had to make a float track. So I could look that up, but maybe I didn't. And maybe I go into my blueprint and I try to create a variable. We'll call this movement curve. We'll expose it and we'll just see what happens. We'll compile, save, go over here. Wait for that. At the very bottom, you see this movement curve. It's defaulting to particle. This is because we did not choose a new class. So let's do that. And if we click here and we start typing float track, movie scene float track, maybe that's what we want, maybe not. Maybe we type in curve and we see something called curve float. Maybe we look into that. And I think this is what we're going to want because these look like the other tracks I can play. So let's try doing a curve float and do an object reference. Okay, again, compile, save, and you'll get a proper default. Okay, if you click the drop down, we can see a little icon that looks like this is something we want. So float curve, we could open that up and take a look. But if you look up the API, this does seem like what we want. So now our question is, well, how do we make a movement curve? If it's looking for something that exists inside of our project files, well, maybe we can make one. So that would be the next thing to try. So I'm gonna go to my project mechanics. I'm gonna right click. You can search through these, but I'll just tell you ahead of time. It's under miscellaneous. And this matching icon right here, this curve, click that. Now these refer to the different tracks inside of the timeline. So in this case, we made a float. It's a 0 to 1. So we want a curve float. So select that. This is going to be our keyframe data. So this is our line that we've been drawing and we've been manipulating the curve. Well, what would this be? Let's make a really simple one called linear lerp. And this will be our default, I think. Hit save all to make sure we save our assets that we create. If you double click it, it's going to open this graph. Looks very similar to what we used before. So now I want to create a few key points. We're going to do the same thing we did when we created the timeline. I'm going to right click and click add key. And remember, we want 0 seconds and the value to be 0. We still want our 0 to 1 second because we are using the lerp, the 0 to 1 for our calculations. I'm going to make a second one, add key. Again, this one's going to be at 1 second. So time 1 and value 1. So then it should play 0 to 1. We'll save that. And let's see what we can do here. If we do movement curve and we do linear lerp, looks like we can slot that one in. Okay, we could test that, but I think while we're still working on these, let's make a few more. At this point, I can actually duplicate this. So if I right click and I duplicate, I want to call this one, let's call this ease lerp. Okay, open this up. And we have what we started off with, but I think for this lerp, let's add our curves here. You'll see that you could either right click over here or they have more tools at the top. I'm gonna do the same thing I did before where I just did auto and that will just flatten them all out like that. So we get a standard ease in, momentum, and ease out. I'll just keep it really simple. I'll save that. And let's make one more. And this one might seem a little weird. We'll call this, the proper term is follow through, lerp. In animation, if you look at the animation principles, follow through is when something slightly overshoots its destination and then settles back. You think if you were to sprint across a room, you couldn't really stop instantly, right? You'd probably slide a little bit. So you kind of overshoot and then you bounce back into position. That's the concept. And to do that, all you need to do is just drag your handle downwards. And you see, this is my position. I'm going to pull down a little bit before I start moving this direction in my for my value. And this one I want to put up a little bit. And I'm going to accent this just a little bit more just so that we can see it. inside of our game. And you can make that very, very, you can do something like that if you want, but I don't recommend it. You can make another one if you want that does that. You can make another one like we had before, a slam moving platform where you have this quick up and then it goes up here and then it slams down. You can make a couple others. You just want to make some standard ones we can reuse. Make sure everything's saved. Save all. So now I can choose a movement curve for different platforms. So I'm going to do this. I'm going to make one of each. I'm going to do this one linear. So linear lerp, this one that I created. I'm going to make this middle one let's do a ease lerp. I'm going to do this side one a follow through. Okay, so these should look a little bit different. I hit play. They're still going to be the same because up to now, wrong one. I'm going to close some of these out now that we don't need them. Up to now, everything's still pulling from the animator, and we haven't really assigned this movement curve to everything. So we're getting the data and we're swapping that out, but we need to take this and put it into the animator. One way you could do this is we could just do a once on start, because every single instance of this blueprint is going to have a different curve. And while we're at it, let's actually set a default. So if we click on movement curve and we go to default value, let's make the default a linear, I think. Just default to linear, and if we want to change it, we can. Compile, save. So now that we have the option to specify new ones, let's actually put the data into the animator. So anytime you're thinking about how can I access a thing to manipulate its data or run a function, you may assume that you need a reference to that thing. And we've been getting the animator in other places, so I think it makes sense to do that same thing, and it's under components. We'll find animator, pull that over here. Again, that's just what I named the timeline. So when I go into this animator, we have an instance of it. Go into there. We want to put a value into a thing, so we could start typing in set, and we could start looking into this. Set animator would define a kind of animator. We may look through here, and if we recognize what our thing is called, it's actually a float curve. If we put in set float curve, we see what we need to do in order to get this to work. So from our animator, want to set a float curve. Well, it needs to know what kind of curve you want to give it. But also I'm noticing that I need to hook these in. So make sure that you don't accidentally go straight through there and be unsure on why it works. So hook this in, and now we need a new float curve. Well, this is going to be our movement curve that the designer specified. So I'm going to get that, plug that in. And the last thing it needs is a float track name. And what this is, if we open up our animator, this is the name of the track that we want to put this curve into, because potentially we could have multiple tracks over here, and it wants to make sure that it puts it into the right one. Honestly, there's probably a better way to do this, but I think just to keep this really clear for now, I'm just going to type this in. There are a few different blueprints that allow you to search for something by string. I will tell you that good coding practices is not to do this too much, because if I were to, for example, type in alpha, which I do know is the name of what I named it. So whatever you name yours, you want to make sure that this name is the same, because if it's not going to know where to assign this thing. So check your spelling. The reason why coders don't like doing this too much is a spelling mistake could be very difficult to troubleshoot. There's probably a way to do some conversions on this, but I think it's going to get too messy. So I'm just going to search that by name, but do be aware this has to perfectly match your track name inside of your animator, so it knows which one. And once we do that, if we compile and we save, and we make sure that we assign these the correct ones, so follow through, ease, and linear, these should look a little bit different when we hit play. See how this one's kind of overshooting? It's going through the floor really quick, and we can make that more obvious if we want. And you see how this one's easing down at the bottom? It's not an instant stop, whereas this one is an instant stop. You can see all of them side by side, and the difference we can get in our animation. We start to add these little details in our curves, and the way we set it up, we can make as many new ones as we want and just slot them in. A designer could very easily come here and choose from some defaults or some pre-made ones which is a pretty handy way of building this, and we can always add more if we want. But this is how you can create new movement paths for your platforms that we've been customizing so far.